Good evening. Good evening and welcome. My name is David White, and I'm honored to serve as Artistic Director for the Lewis Public Library's Spoken Word Society. The Spoken Word Society celebrates the tradition and artistry of oral storytelling through lectures, performances, discussions, demonstrations, and other public shared experiences. I'm joined in these efforts by Rebecca Lowe, the Adult Program Coordinator of the library, her associate Jesse Landwehr, and community volunteers Pamela Malsh, Garrett Dornega, and John Bracco. And our work is strongly supported by the dynamic and bold leadership of Library Director Jill DiPaolo. The Spoken Word Society programming, offered free of charge to the public, is funded in part by a grant from the Delaware Division of the Arts, a state agency in partnership with the National Endowment for the Arts. But the bulk of our support comes from community agencies and supporters like you. If you would like to help us, we will have ushers standing by as you leave with collection baskets, or you may make a small donations with a credit card at the tip-tap machine in the lobby. If you would like to make a larger gift to the Spoken Word Society or to the library's general fund as a part of your annual giving this year, please see Rebecca Lowe tonight or whenever the library is open. Tonight, we are pleased to join with Paul Sparrow's Fireside Chats to present No Ordinary Time, the words of Eleanor Roosevelt, featuring Paul and Suzanne Savoy. Paul Sparrow is a writer, historical consultant, and former director of the Franklin D. Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum. Before moving to the FDR Library, he was deputy director and senior vice president at the Newseum in Washington, D.C. He's the author of the book, Awakening the Spirit of America, FDR's War of Words with Charles Lindbergh and the Battle to Save Democracy. Paul is a good friend to the library and also was a co-founder of the singer-songwriter series in Lewis. Suzanne Savoy is a renowned classically trained theater artist who has worked on stages across the world, in film, and in a number of recurring roles on television, including shows How to Get Away with Murder, Full Circle, The Nick, House of Cards, Better Call Saul, and many, many others. I keep stumbling on her. Whenever I say, and I call her and say, hey, you're just on the TV, it's great. Her most recent film, All of It, recently was awarded Best Comedy Feature at the Marina Del Rey Festival. No stranger to our stages here in Lewis, Suzanne has had a big hand in the Spoken Word Society's growth, having appeared in several of our Shakespeare Festival activities, curating the Lunchtime Story Reading for Adults program for more than 5 years, premiering her new work, The Book of Poesy, and appearing with Gerald Dickens in A Child's Journey with Chickens. Chickens. Oh boy. Gotta be that kind of night. Yeah, trying to get through too much, 2 hours. With Charles Dickens. in performing, and also in performing dramatic readings of Truman Capote's holiday works with Jack Herholt, held here every year since 2019. She and Jack will be presenting Thanksgiving Visitor on this very stage on Saturday, November 22nd at 5. All of the seats are spoken for like they were tonight, but there is a wait list started, and I encourage you to sign up for that. We have a good track record of getting the wait list folks in. As you can see tonight, we got them all in. Ladies and gentlemen, Paul Sparrow and Suzanne Savoy in No Ordinary Time, the words of Eleanor Roosevelt.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Rebecca. Can we get a round of applause? Does this stage look great or what, huh? All new equipment, new stage, new lights, new microphones. Now we just have to do something interesting with it all. Anyway, Suzanne, thank you very much for joining us tonight. It's been so much fun working with her on this program. I think you're going to like it. It's the first for me. I've never done this exact format before, so let's get started. Eleanor Roosevelt was just an extraordinary woman and a first lady unlike any others before or after. Her commitment to human rights earned her the title of the First Lady of the World after she left the White House. Now, many think of her as this sort of stern school marm who's always lecturing people about, how she thinks they should behave. But she's so much more than that. So she had a very simple rule for living.
Life is like a parachute jump. You've got to get it right the first time.
She and her husband, FDR, were the targets of relentless media attacks and gossip about them. Their children, even their dog Fala, came under the attack. And she also had a simple rule about people.
Great minds discuss ideas. Average minds discuss events. Small minds discuss people.
could say the same thing about today's media environment. Eleanor Roosevelt held her first press conference on March 6, 1933, just 2 days after FDR was inaugurated. Now, no first lady had ever held a press conference before, and it was a strategic move on her part, specifically to boost the status of female journalists who were not allowed to participate in FDR's press conferences. So she said, only women can participate in my press conferences. And she had this to say about the journalists who were invited.
The time has come for courage and common sense on everyone's part. I will focus on topics of special interest and value to the women of the country, and will not encroach on my husband's side of the news.
Of course, she almost immediately encroached on FDR's side of the news, taking on anti-lynching laws, equal pay for women, advice for those struggling to survive in the Great Depression. Eleanor traveled the country, giving speeches and radio addresses. And on January 1st, 1936, she launched a daily newspaper column called My Day. In it, she discussed her daily routine and her family and friends. In her first column, she discussed how she celebrated New Year's Eve the night before.
I wonder if anyone else glories in cold and snow without, an open fire within, and the luxury of a tray of food, all by oneself in one's own room. I realize it sounds extremely selfish and a little odd to look upon this as a festive occasion. Nevertheless, last night was a festive occasion, for I spent it in this way. The house was full of young people. My husband had a cold and was in bed having milk toast for his supper. So I said a polite good night to everyone, and at 7:30 closed my door, lit my fire, and settled down to a nice long evening by myself. I read things which I have had in my briefcase for weeks, and I went to sleep at 10:30. As I haven't been to bed for weeks before 1 a.m. and often later, this was so unusual that I woke this morning with a feeling that I must have slept for several years.
It's an interesting thing to admit in your first column. Now, she was not exaggerating. She often stayed up well past midnight to complete her day's tasks, which included writing as many as 100 letters a day, mostly in response to people who had written to her. In February of 1939, the great opera singer Marian Anderson was denied permission to perform at the Constitution Hall in Washington, D.C. by the Daughters of the American Revolution, who owned the building. They refused her because she was Black. Now, Eleanor was a friend and a fan of Anderson and invited her to sing at the White House on several occasions. After multiple attempts to get the DAR to change its mind, she resigned from the organization in one of my favorite letters.
I am afraid that I've never been a very useful member of the Daughters of the American Revolution, so I know it will make very little difference to you whether I resign or whether I continue to be a member of your organization. However, I am in complete disagreement with the attitude taken in refusing Constitution Hall to a great artist. You have set an example which seems to me unfortunate, and I feel obliged to send in to you my resignation. You had an opportunity to lead in an enlightened way, and it seems to me that your organization has failed. I realize that many people will not agree with me, but feeling as I do, this seems to me the only proper procedure to follow.
Of course, the Daughters of the American Revolution would not mind losing their first lady as a member. By the way, she printed that letter in her My Day column. And you can see the letter here. This is actually a draft of the letter, but the specificity of it is what I love. I'm sure it won't bother you at all if I quit. Marian Anderson, of course, went on to sing at the Lincoln Memorial with an audience of thousands, thanks to Eleanor and Interior Secretary Harold Ickes. Now, a much more serious crisis happened later that year. Eleanor often wrote about world affairs, and on September 2nd, 1939, the day after Hitler invaded Poland, she had quite a lot to say in her My Day column.
At 5 o'clock this morning, our telephone rang, and it was the president in Washington to tell me the sad news that Germany had invaded Poland and that her planes were bombing Polish cities. He told me that Hitler was about to address the Reichstag, so we turned on the radio and listened until 6 o'clock. As I listened to Hitler's speech, I thought, how can you feel kindly toward a man who tells you that German minorities have been brutally treated, first in Czechoslovakia, then in Danzig, but that never can Germany be accused of being unfair to a minority? I have seen evidence with my own eyes of what this same man has done to people belonging to a minority group, not only Jews, but Christians who have long been German citizens. Can one help but question his integrity? His knowledge of history seems somewhat sketchy too, for after all, Poland possessed Danzig many years prior to the time that it ever belonged to Germany. And how can you say that you do not intend to make war on women and children and then send planes to bomb cities?
With war raging in Europe, Eleanor often took to the radio to encourage Americans to support the many refugees fleeing the horrors of Hitler. But her efforts to help desperate Jewish immigrants were met with a rabid anti-Semitism typical of that time. Her political statements unleashed a wave of criticism, most of it blatantly sexist. She refused to stop or to accept any defeat. She wrote in Good Housekeeping magazine in March 1940 that
when a woman fails, it is much more serious than when a man fails, because the average person attributes that failure not to the individual, but to the fact that she is a woman.
In the spring of 1940, Hitler seemed unstoppable, and FDR was faced with a serious, difficult decision. Should he run for an unprecedented third term? Eleanor was opposed to the idea. She did not like living in the fishbowl of the White House, but she soon realized he was determined to lead the country through the war. During the Democratic Convention in Chicago in July 1940, delegates easily renominated FDR, but a terrible fight broke out over his choice to replace his current conservative vice president with the very liberal Henry Wallace. Wallace was a brilliant scientist and the Secretary of the Agriculture, but he was a die-hard New Dealer with some strange mystical beliefs. Many Democrats hated him. With the party on the verge of civil war, FDR asked Eleanor to go to Chicago and save his vice presidential nominee. She did, and gave one of her most important speeches.
I know, and you know, that any man who is in an office of great responsibility faces a heavier responsibility, perhaps, than any man has ever faced before in this country. Therefore, to be a candidate of either great political party is a very serious and a very solemn thing. You cannot treat it as an ordinary nomination in an ordinary time. We people in the United States have got to realize today that we face now a serious situation. Therefore, the President of the United States cannot make a campaign in the usual sense of the word. He must be on his job. So, each and every one of you who give him this responsibility, because you will make the campaign. You will have to rise above considerations which are narrow and partisan. You must know that this is the time when all good men and women give every bit of service and strength to their country that they have to give. This is a time when it is the United States that we fight for, the domestic policies that we have established as a party, that we must believe in, that we must carry forward. And in the world, we have a position of great responsibility. We cannot tell from day to day what may come. This is no ordinary time, no time for weighing anything except what we can do best for the country as a whole. And that responsibility rests on each and every one of us as individuals. No man who is a candidate or who is president can carry this situation alone. This is only carried by a united people who love their country and who will live for it to the fullest of their ability, with the highest ideals, with a determination that their party shall be absolutely devoted to the good of the nation as a whole, and to doing what this country can to bring the world to a safer and happier condition.
Truly amazing thing about that speech is that she basically ad-libbed it from a half a page of notes and bullet points. And of course, her line, "This is no ordinary time," has come to define not only that era and that moment, but was the title that Doris Kearns Goodwin used in her Pulitzer Prize winning book. Now, when I gave Doris a tour of the library and got the half page of notes out and showed it to her, she held it in her hands and she told me she had not seen it for years, but it reinforced for her the opinion that Eleanor was perhaps the most brilliant and important first lady in American history. Now think about it. She got up in front of 20,000 people in the most vulnerable moment of her husband's career and ad-libbed a speech. As soon as she finished, they nominated Henry Wallace to be his vice president. Eleanor wrote her My Day column 6 days a week for 26 years. Her writing became more and more political as the times grew darker and darker. In May of 1941, she wrote,
"We in this country are opposing totalitarian governments, but we are not opposing the refugees who want to help us make this country safe, nor citizens who have come to us from other lands and who are loyal and good Americans. This demands from us a refusal to be hysterical and an ability to use our powers of observation, but to use them wisely."
all four of Franklin and Eleanor's sons served in the military during World War II. The three oldest sons, James and Elliot and Franklin, were all serving when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. John, the youngest, joined the Navy right after he graduated from UVA in early 1942. On that terrible day that will live in infamy, December 7th, 1941, Eleanor Roosevelt was the first member of the administration to address the nation. During her regularly scheduled Sunday night radio program. It is a remarkable testament to her empathy and the command of the English language.
I am speaking to you tonight at a very serious moment in our history. The cabinet is convening and the leaders in Congress are meeting with the president. The State Department and Army and Navy officials have been with the president all afternoon. In fact, the Japanese ambassador was talking to the president at the very time that Japan's airships were bombing our citizens in Hawaii and the Philippines and sinking one of our transports loaded with lumber on its way to Hawaii. By tomorrow morning, the members of Congress will have a full report and be ready for action. In the meantime, we, the people, are already prepared for action. For months now, the knowledge that something of this kind might happen has been hanging over our heads, and yet it seemed impossible to believe, impossible to drop the everyday things of life and feel that there was only one thing which was important: preparation to meet an enemy no matter where he struck. That is all over now, and there is no more uncertainty. We know what we have to face, and we know that we are ready to face it. I should like to say just a word to the women in the country tonight. I have a boy at sea on a destroyer. For all I know, he may be on his way to the Pacific. 2 of my children are in coast cities on the Pacific. Many of you all over the country have boys in the services who will now be called upon to go into action. You have friends and families in what has suddenly become a danger zone. You cannot escape anxiety. You cannot escape a clutch of fear at your heart. And yet I hope that the certainty of what we have to meet will make you rise above these fears. We must go about our daily business, more determined than ever to do the ordinary things as well as we can. And when we find a way to do anything more in our communities, to help others, to build morale, to give a feeling of security, we must do it. Whatever is asked of us, I am sure we can accomplish it. We are the free and unconquerable people of the United States of America.
Her line, "You cannot escape the clutch of fear at your heart," is so powerful and so personal. Her remarks, by the way, were not reviewed by FDR, by his press secretary, by anybody in the White House. That's the level of trust and respect that she had at that extraordinary moment. They allowed her to go and speak to the American people. And of course, she did a fantastic job. Eleanor was a tireless advocate for equality, for democracy, and for women's rights. She fought for better working conditions and child care for the millions of women filling defense factory jobs while their husbands were fighting overseas. She traveled the world, including the Pacific Theater during the war, where she visited with wounded soldiers. This is about the women working. This is about the wounded soldiers. She traveled the world, including the Pacific Theater, where she visited with wounded sailors and soldiers. So here are a few of her statements made during the war.
October 23rd, 1942. The very weaknesses of human nature are what make it so important that we keep a constantly watchful eye on our government, and that in turn, our government watches us with equal care. September 4th, 1943. No one can make you feel inferior without your consent. September 1944. If silence seems to give approval, then remaining silent is cowardly.
After nearly 4 long years of war, Franklin Roosevelt died on April 12, 1945. It was a shock to his family, his country, and the world. This is the last photograph taken of him. He was buried at his family estate in Hyde Park, New York, in his mother's beloved rose garden, right next to his favorite dogs who were buried in the rose garden as well. Eleanor and her children mourned his passing. Two of their sons were able to come back for the funeral. One was engaged in the Pacific, couldn't come. You can see Eleanor there in the black shroud. Her oldest daughter, Anna's to her right, and her son, Elliot, is to her left. It was a moment of extraordinary sadness for the world because he had become sort of the savior of democracy. Again, this was April 1945, so just a month before the surrender of Germany. The war was going well, and he refused to step down because he knew that he was sending so many young men to their death in the war that he couldn't walk away from his own responsibility. Eleanor wrote, just 5 days after his death, Eleanor wrote a painfully personal My Day column.
When you have lived for a long time in close contact with the loss and grief which today pervades the world, any personal sorrow seems to be lost in the general sadness of humanity. For a long time, all hearts have been heavy for every serviceman sacrificed in the war. There is only one way in which those of us who live can repay the dead who have given their utmost for the cause of liberty and justice. They died in the hope that through their sacrifice, an enduring peace would be built and a more just world would emerge for humanity. While my husband was in Albany, and for some years after coming to Washington, his chief interest was in seeing that the average human being was given a fair chance for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That was what made him always interested in the problems of minority groups and of any group which was at a disadvantage. As the war clouds gathered and the inevitable involvement of this country became more evident, his objective was always to deal with the problems of the war, political and military, so that eventually an organization might be built to prevent future wars. Perhaps in his wisdom, the Almighty is trying to show us that a leader may chart the way, may point out the road to lasting peace, but that many leaders and many peoples must do the building. It cannot be the work of one man, nor can the responsibility be laid upon his shoulders. And so when the time comes for peoples to assume the burden more fully, he is given rest. God grant that we may have the wisdom and courage to build a peaceful world with justice and opportunity for all peoples the world over.
That last line really summarizes everything that Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt stood for and fought for during their entire life as public servants. Now, Eleanor, believe it or not, moved out of the White House within a week. And if you think about the fact they've been living there for 12 years, it was no easy trick. She told a reporter at the time that the story is over now that FDR died. But of course, her story was not over. She divided her time between her beloved, she divided her time between her beloved Valkill cottage in Hyde Park and her apartment in Greenwich Village. I'm just going to do an aside here to say, if you ever get up to Hyde Park or the Hudson Valley, I strongly encourage you to visit Valkill. It is a lovely, lovely site. You really understand Eleanor when you go to visit it. Obviously, the library is there and the Springwood, the home, the Roosevelt home, but Valkill is something that's very, very special. The only a National Historic Site dedicated to a First Lady in the whole country. Sorry. Commercial's over. Harry Truman had different ideas than that her story was over. He quickly selected her to be a part of the U.S. delegation to the United Nations. And this was a very important selection that, of course, all of the men on the commission sort of disapproved of, but they thought, well, I guess we have to give her something. She brought all of her passion and commitment to fulfilling FDR's vision, his dream of an international diplomatic institution. As a matter of fact, when he died, FDR was working on the speech he planned to give at the opening of the United Nations, the drafting of their charter in San Francisco at the end of April. She was chosen to lead the Committee on Human Rights, mainly because they thought it was a committee that wasn't going to do anything. And that work she did on the UDHR, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, is really extraordinary. And it shows so many things. Remember, all the other people on this committee were from countries, that had been at war with each other in some cases just months earlier. And they passed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in the General Assembly in 1948. It starts with what I consider a world-changing statement.
All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. Everyone is entitled to all the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration without distinction of any kind, such as race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth, or other status.
Now, that first line, all human beings are born free and equal, was a truly revolutionary statement. Originally, it said, quote, all men are born free and equal. Eleanor, working with one of the only other women on the commission, who was from India, fought to have that wording changed to all people. Now, it seems like a small change, all men, all people. You have to understand what the world was like in 1948. Many of the countries on the commission and in the United Nations still considered women lesser citizens. Some of those countries, women did not even have rights to vote, to own credit cards, to own property. So this idea that all people are given equal rights, not just the men, was truly revolutionary. And because of that statement in the UDHR, many of the constitutions that were drafted by new countries emerging from the era of colonialism incorporated that language into their constitutions. We've recorded at least 50 national documents that incorporate that language, the idea of all people, not all men. Yeah, our founding document, right? All men are created equal. Well, we could have fixed that, I think. Sorry, just digression again. So one of my favorite speeches of hers was one she gave on my 4th birthday. I was there. No, I wasn't. For the 10th anniversary of the passage of the UDHR. So this is now 1958. So this is the excerpt from the passage of the UDHR.
Where, after all, do human rights begin? In small places close to home, so close and so small that they cannot be seen on any map of the world. Yet they are the world of the individual person, the neighborhood he lives in, the school or college he attends, the factory, farm, or office where he works. Such are the places where every man, woman, and child seeks equal justice, equal opportunity, equal dignity without discrimination. Unless these rights have meaning there, they have little meaning anywhere. Without concerted citizen action to uphold them close to home, we shall look in vain for progress in the larger world.
Where do human rights begin? In small places close to home. It's such a brilliant statement and such a call to action. It's basically saying, don't count on the United Nations to fix things. Fix things in your own home, in your own school, in your own place of employment. It really is, to my mind, something that she understood so deeply, and she committed to this idea that every person, every encounter, you should have respect for the other person. Anyway, I find that I get chills. It's all, the whole speech is on YouTube. You can look at it, and it's really quite remarkable. So Eleanor Roosevelt was voted the most admired woman in America For the first 12 years, Gallup conducted the poll. She was finally surpassed by Jackie Kennedy in 1962, just a few months before Eleanor died. During that time, she was almost undoubtedly the most powerful woman in the Democratic Party, perhaps the most recognizable woman in the world other than the Queen of England, and a relentless critic of any leader, particularly like Eisenhower, who did not follow her advice. But those whom she admired, including Dr. Martin Luther King, had her unwavering support. She said this in 1960.
I am appalled to find that a Georgia court has sentenced the Reverend Martin Luther King to serve 4 months in prison, a sentence that obviously stems from his participation in a sit-in demonstration. Previously, he was under a suspended sentence in a traffic case, which he felt was trumped up. And now he is sentenced for having violated this suspension because the probation had been based on non-violation of a state or federal law for a year. I hardly think that the judge in Atlanta has any idea of the effect of this that this decision will have, not only on public opinion in the North, but on world opinion. The people of the world will condemn not Georgia, unfortunately, the United States for treating as a criminal a man who is looked upon with respect. Our judges seem to have little realization of the effect on the leadership of the US that such decisions have.
Eleanor Roosevelt's commitment to the struggle for civil rights was absolute. She donated her time, her money, and her considerable influence toward the cause. One of the first actions she took when she left the White House was to join the board of the NAACP. In 1956, John F. Kennedy wrote the Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Profiles in Courage. In 1960, when he campaigned for the Democratic nomination for president, Eleanor initially supported his opponent, her good friend, Adlai Stevenson. Now, Eleanor had a long and contentious relationship with JFK's father, Joe Kennedy, and never forgave him for opposing her husband's effort to come to the aid of Winston Churchill in the run-up to World War II. Eleanor criticized JFK for not working harder on civil rights legislation and his refusal to condemn Senator Joseph McCarthy. She said this of JFK.
I wish young Kennedy would show less profile and more courage.
After the first televised presidential debate between JFK and Richard Nixon, she wrote to Kennedy to give him her review.
I am so prejudiced against Mr. Nixon that I dare not trust my own opinion. But I am going to tell you what some people felt. One person said he felt you spoke a little too fast and had not yet mastered the habit of including your audience at every point. Someone else said they thought you appeared a little too confident. I did not agree with this, but I thought I should tell you. On the whole, I think it is a milestone for TV and a really good way to campaign because it reaches so many people.
Eleanor did eventually endorse JFK for president and campaigned actively for him. He appointed her to head the Commission on the Status of Women, which is ironic, as she repeatedly sent him letters listing qualified women for all the positions in his administration, but he did not hire any of them. Shortly before she died, she wrote a book titled Common Sense Etiquette, and she offered this advice.
True patriotism springs from a belief in the dignity of the individual, freedom and equality not only for Americans, but for all people on earth, universal brotherhood and goodwill, and a constant striving toward the principles and ideals on which this country was founded.
She continued to do radio and television programs, and actually did a television program which she had John F. Kennedy, who was president at the time, on, and she grilled him a little bit. It's also on YouTube, worth watching. And she traveled the world giving speeches in support of the United Nations, women's rights, and racial equality. There's a photograph in the FDR library in her gallery that shows her in 1962, just months before she died, carrying her little suitcase across the tarmac of LaGuardia Airport. No handlers, no entourage, just on her way somewhere all by herself. Very powerful picture. She died in November 1962, and the world mourned her passing. There will never be a woman like her. At her memorial service, her good friend Adlai Stevenson said,
Her life was crowded, restless, and fearless. She walked in the slums and ghettos of the world, not on a tour of inspection, but as one who could not find contentment while others were in distress. This was not sacrifice. This, for Eleanor Roosevelt, was the only meaningful way of life. Like so many others, I have lost more than a beloved friend. I have lost an inspiration. She would rather light a candle than curse the darkness, and her glow has warmed the world.
at her burial, there were John F. Kennedy, Harry Truman, and Ike Eisenhower all attended. Richard Nixon did not. But it was a moment that really reflected the extraordinary global influence that she had. There was a moment of silence at the United Nations. Countries all over the world flew their flags at half-mast. It was a global moment of mourning for a woman who had dedicated her life to those who needed it the most. Her last book, Tomorrow Is Now, was published posthumously after she died. It is filled with her hopes for the future and many words of wisdom. We shall end with this one.
Tomorrow is a mystery. Today is a gift. That is why we call it the present.
Now, I'm sure you have some questions. We're going to have microphones. Please raise your hand. We'll call on you, but wait for the microphone to come so that our audience online, can hear what you have to say. So raise your hand. Who's going to go first? Okay, over here.
Yeah, I can.
It's on.
It's on. It's on.
Oh, it is on. There were two events that were rather spectacular during the time. I'm pretty sure I know how she felt about them, but I don't know whether she said anything. One was when the St. Louis ship full of that carried Jewish refugees was refused entrance to Cuba and stopped off the coast of the United States. Eventually landed in Holland. I'm pretty sure she was part of an effort to help them. I don't know whether she said anything publicly. FDR did not. And the other was at the time of the intern of the Japanese after Pearl Harbor. Did she express herself on that? That would have been a very difficult time to do that, but interesting.
I'll start with the second question first because it's a little bit easier. So immediately after Pearl Harbor, Eleanor Roosevelt flew to San Francisco and had a press conference in Japantown, surrounded by Japanese American citizens. And she came out very strongly with the idea that we had to embrace our American citizens of different nationalities, even opponents. And she was sort of very active in trying to prevent the backlash that happened. She strongly disagreed with the decision of President Roosevelt to Executive Order 9066 to declare the West Coast a military zone, allowing the military leaders to remove people that they felt were a threat to national security. She never publicly criticized FDR or the the forced removal and incarceration of these Japanese American citizens and Japanese nationals, partly because it was such a politically volatile situation. However, she did visit the camps. She visited Manzanar, and she worked tirelessly behind the scenes to loosen the restrictions on the activity of people in the camps. She got the government to agree that college-age students could leave the camps and go to universities and colleges or take jobs as long as they weren't on the West Coast. She worked very diligently to improve the living conditions on the camps, but she never came out and publicly opposed or criticized the decision. Many of them did, and she worked hard to have the Army accept them, because at first, of course, the Army didn't want them. So yes, that was another thing that she was involved with and supported strongly, but again, behind the scenes. St. Louis is a much more complicated story, and I'm not sure I totally agree with your description of it. In fact, the ship was turned away from Cuba for financial reasons. The Cubans were trying to extort the Jewish refugees. Instead of paying $500 each, they wanted them to pay $5,000 each. The ship had no landing rights in the United States. If they did land in the United States, they would have, if they were allowed to stay, they would have prevented other Jews who had been granted visas to come into the country. And while this was all happening, Eleanor and Franklin were entertaining the King and Queen of England. Now, one of the things that happened during their hosting of the King and Queen of England is that FDR met privately with the King. We don't have specific documentation to prove this, but the next day, England announced that they will be accepting the Jews aboard the St. Louis and convinced France and Holland to do so as well. So the ship, people on the ship celebrated. They went back and they were going back to free countries, because this was in the summer of 1939, before the war had started. So Eleanor never made a comment about St. Louis publicly. However, there was another ship that came through several months later, and the name of the ship is skipping my mind right now. The Kwanzaa, right, which did have permission to land in the United States. And when it landed, the passengers, the Jewish refugee passengers on board, sued the government to allow them to stay. And in that case, Eleanor did come out strongly in favor of them being allowed to stay. And in fact, they were granted temporary visas, essentially, because the ship had legal rights to dock in the United States. And so they were able to then petition the courts for a redress of grievances, as the First Amendment might say. So it's a little bit more complicated. Eleanor tended to be careful about criticizing specific policies. The most public disagreement she had with FDR was over the federal anti-lynching laws, which she campaigned aggressively for and challenged some of the decisions of FDR not to support those laws, because the Southern Democrats that controlled Congress wouldn't let them get to a vote. And if they had been passed, then the Southern Democrats would never have approved any of FDR's New Deal legislation. But the idea of when she criticized FDR, when she didn't, is a very good one, and we could do a whole program on that. Okay, we have another question?
Not so much a question, but a comment. She was tutored privately until she was 15 and then went to a boarding school in England. So her education finished at high school. it's her grasp of language and her ability to express herself is remarkable. And it must have been a combination of intuitiveness and picking up from people around her.
She actually had quite a good education, particularly when she went to Ravenswood and studied under Madame Sylvestre, who was the woman who ran this private school for the global elite, young women, many of whom were sort of there as a finishing school. But Madame Sylvestre had a very, very rigorous academic program, and she took Eleanor under her wings and saw in her this sort of genius that most people didn't realize. And so that education she got there was quite remarkable. And she came back and was forced to go through the debutante process, which she hated. And as soon as she finished with that, she immediately went to work at a settlement house in New York, helping the poorest, most desperate immigrants in those terrible tenement ghettos as a way to do what she thought was necessary to help those people. But yes, her language skills are remarkable. But more importantly, her ability to connect with the average human person. I mean, that line, you have a small clutch at your heart, right? But she's talking to the women whose sons are going off to war. It's just such an amazing line. But yes, I agree with you. She has amazing grasp of the language. Now, you had a chance to read all this. You hadn't really been immersed in Eleanor before. What is your takeaway from her language versus, say, Shakespeare?
Well, it doesn't rhyme, but the more I read it, the more emotional intelligence I saw in her works. In particular, her address to the American people right after Pearl Harbor. At first I was thinking, oh, she was being very comforting, but the more I read it, I realized, no, she was really rallying. She was like a Joan of Arc in a way. She was rallying the people and giving them that sense of, you've got this. You're already ready. They're working on it in Washington, but we the people are ready. And I thought that was amazing that she understood that that was what the people needed to hear. That's what the citizens needed to hear at that moment. Because everyone was afraid. Everyone was, I was in New York City, downtown when during 9/11, and my daughter was in school down there, and none of us knew what was going on. We knew that the towers had been struck. We didn't know what was going on, and that fear of what's coming next and where is it coming from and who's doing this and why and what's next. We have a little Eleanor Roosevelt activity going on right here. Knitting. And I would have loved to have someone like Eleanor Roosevelt talking to me and telling me, okay, it's okay, you've got this. We're ready for the next step. So I just think she was not only an intellectually brilliant woman, but also an emotionally brilliant leader who knew what people needed at a particular moment in time.
Yeah, her last line in that speech, "We are the unconquerable people of the United States," sort of gives that sense of confidence.
It gave everybody a job to do. And that's, you want to tell the anecdote about the knitting?
So when the United Nations finally voted on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, you know about the United Nations. Everything takes a long time. Everybody has to get up. Eleanor Roosevelt was knitting, which she did a lot during these long sessions. She was knitting, and so when the vote is finalized and the UDHR passes, she was given a standing ovation in the General Assembly, and she just sat there and smiled, continued to knit. Yes, it's a true Eleanor hobby. Anyway, we have a question in the back there.
You hinted about Eleanor's relationship with Eisenhower, what she thought of. Will you expand on that?
Well, Eisenhower was a great military leader. He was a great political leader during a surprisingly difficult time in American history, but he certainly wasn't a progressive. And Eleanor criticized him both in print and on the radio to the point that he banned her from the White House. So they had a contentious relationship. She did commend him after he sent troops into Little Rock to reopen the public school there. But to her, it was a little too little, a little too late. But she did have a difficult relationship with him. And of course, he was a, five-star general. He wasn't used to people criticizing him, particularly not in this public vein. And so, yeah, they had a difficult relationship. Okay, we have time for a couple more, or we can let you go home and watch the end of the football game. Yeah, we have two over here.
Well, there's one online.
Okay.
Eleanor faced many obstacles in her lifetime. How do you think this made her who she ultimately became?
Well, that's a great question because Eleanor was orphaned at a young age. Her mother was a great beauty and a debutante who really thought Eleanor was ugly and belittled her and was just really terrible to her and died when she was only 8. Her father was a chronic alcoholic and wasn't abusive. He adored Eleanor, but he would always say, "I'll be there for your birthday," and then not show up. And, "I'll take you to the park," and then not take her to the park. And he died when she was 10. So she had a very traumatic childhood. She went to live with her grandmother in this sort of strange, dark house up in the Hudson Valley. And so she really had to find in herself some strength. She had enormous insecurities, right? She felt unloved and unwanted. And so her whole defense against this was, I need to be useful. So from a very early age, she decided that she would be useful and she would find ways to be useful. And of course, as her political comprehension of the world increased, she more and more decided that that way to be useful was to be politically active and to champion those people who had no other champions. And I think it really deeply affected her insecurity, her sense of being less, really drove her forward to do more. And you remember her uncle, Teddy Roosevelt, was another great champion. And I think she looked to him as an inspiration to say, I'm going to follow his lead in fighting for those who need someone to fight for them. Okay, we had another question over here in front. I think. Oh, I answered. Okay. Anything else? Over here.
This might be a silly question. I'm not a historian, but after talking about his third term, she addressed the convention, the progressive vice president that he had, and then he died. Did that guy become president?
No, so this was the third term, 1940. Henry Wallace became president. At the end of the third term, the Democrat who opposed Wallace were able to push him aside, and Harry Truman was put forward as the vice presidential candidate in the election of 1944. So he was elected in November of 44 with Truman. Truman be sworn in as vice president in January of 1945, and then becomes president in April when FDR dies. So yes, it's a little confusing. FDR had 3 vice presidents. The first one, Cactus Jack Warner from Texas, was a tobacco spitting conservative who really didn't like Roosevelt. Roosevelt didn't like him, but Roosevelt needed him on the ticket in 1932 so he could take Texas. All right. Any more questions? Over here, I see one. And
if we visit the library, does it have information on their children and grandchildren? Does it go on in perpetuity? Or is each presidential library different in that regard?
it's a great question. Yes, it has a lot of information about the children and their roles both within the family and with and politically. It doesn't go into a lot of detail. There is an interactive family tree where you can explore that goes all the way back to the original Klaus von Roosevelt, who arrived in New York in 1640, and how the two branches of the family, Teddy Roosevelt branch went up to Long Island, and the Franklin Roosevelt branch went up to Hudson Valley. So there is a lot of information about them, but it doesn't really get into the grandchildren so much and the following lives. Every presidential library is different and handles things a little differently. FDR's is unique. It was the first federal library. He donated not just the land on his mother's property and raised the money for the building of the library, but he donated not just his federal papers, but all of his personal possessions, 20,000 priceless books, 10,000 works of art. The only thing he didn't donate, and essentially giving to the American people, that he didn't donate to the National Archives was his stamp collection, which was quite famous. He collected stamps. He had about 1.2 million stamps when he died, because he wanted to give them to his children, because his children weren't crazy about the fact that he gave away their inheritance. As his one son said, at the library, the only non-authentic furniture is the desk that's in his private study up there. It's a replica because his son, John, took the desk with him. And when we contacted him to try to get him to, or actually he had died, but his wife, she's still alive and she still has it, his fifth wife. She said that, my husband always said, my father gave away not one, not two, but three mansions. I'm keeping the damn desk.